So we were at our home, and we were having dinner in the basement floor when we heard screaming in the household next door. And the Turks had attacked and were raping the woman there and killing the husband. So it was a mob of desperate people surging toward the quay, and my mother almost fainted on the way, and my brother and father had to carry her practically. But I remember, and we reached the quay and we sat down among thousands of people, and the city in back of us is burning. The Turks had carte blanche to do anything they wanted in the city, to arrest, to kill, to rape, to burn. Soon the whole city was in flames.
That was Vartan Haratunyan from Smyrna, a survivor of the Armenian Genocide. Welcome to Radio Intifada, voices from Calcutta to Casablanca. Tomorrow is April 24th, a day commemorated worldwide in memory of the 1.5 million Armenians who fell victim to the first genocide of the 20th century. It was on this day that the Ottoman officials brutally killed Armenian politicians, intellectuals, and scientists, leaving a leaderless population to follow. From 1915 to 1918, Ottoman citizens of Armenian descent faced systematic torture, rape, dehydration, murder, and forced exile into the deserts of Deir Zor, where most perished. But April 24th is more than a day of commemoration for Armenians. It's a day of awareness, to remind the world that with Turkey's continual denial and distortion of historical evidence, the last stage of genocide still continues. We have with us today three prominent scholars who will help shed light on the various aspects of the Armenian Genocide. First is Dr. Samantha Power. She is with the Carr Center for Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She's the Pulitzer Prize winner for her book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, and is currently on President Obama's National Security Council. Dr. Power will help us look at America's response to all of the genocides that occurred in the 20th century and the benefits to U.S. recognition. But first, we will turn to an interview conducted earlier with Dr. Samantha Power. Dr. Power is a professor of practice of global leadership and public policy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, where she was the founding executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. Her latest book is Chasing the Flame, a biography of Sergio Vieira de Mello, the UN envoy killed by a suicide bomber in Iraq. Her book, A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide, which we'll be discussing today, was awarded the 2003 Pulitzer Prize. Welcome, Dr. Power.
Well, sorry, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Before we can take a look at the U.S. response to the Armenian Genocide, let's take a look at how the U.S. usually responds to genocide. Maybe you could brief us, starting from Cambodia, going to Iraq, to Bosnia, Rwanda, and finishing up with Darfur.
Well, there's a pattern in human history, of course, that goes way back before the 20th century of groups setting out to target other groups for destruction, and that's why in the wake of the Holocaust, countries of the new United Nations pulled together this convention called the Genocide Convention, obliging countries to prevent, punish, and suppress this horror of a crime. And unfortunately, while a lot of countries agreed to ratify the convention, the United States was a very late signatory, late ratifier of the convention. But nonetheless, the spirit of never again kind of caught on a couple decades after the Holocaust, and you started to see commemoration of the Holocaust and, of course, a museum being built on the Mall in Washington. But unfortunately, in real time, that didn't translate into a top-down commitment to do anything about genocide that was happening in contemporary times. So when Pol Pot, of course, wiped out some 2 to 3 million Cambodians between 1975 and 1978-79, the U.S. was very preoccupied, understandably, I suppose, with its recent exit from Vietnam, very anti-Vietnamese and therefore very anti-Chinese, sort of process the events in Cambodia through that prism, putting national interests above the prevention of genocide. And so even the Carter administration, which was known for putting human rights on the map, never really spoke out about the Khmer Rouge and what they were doing. The Reagan years followed, of course. Saddam Hussein gassed and murdered some 200,000 to 300,000 Kurdish Iraqis, Kurds who lived in northern Iraq and elsewhere. And the Reagan administration's response, believe it or not, was to actually double U.S. aid to Iraq in the wake of Saddam Hussein's genocide against the Kurds. So the same atrocities that were invoked by President Bush to justify the war in Iraq back in 2003 had no effect at all, really, on thinking back in 1987, 88, 89 about what our relationship to Saddam should be. Rwanda is a story well told, I think, in the film Hotel Rwanda and the documentary Ghosts of Rwanda. But the really sad chapter of that is that Clinton administration, I think, was filled with people who cared a lot about mass atrocity, but didn't, in the wake of Somalia, a little bit like the Carter administration in the wake of Vietnam, didn't feel that they had the domestic political support and didn't themselves know Rwanda enough or perhaps care enough about Rwanda specifically to take real leadership in the international system. And so 800,000 people were killed in 100 days back in 1994. Bill Clinton says it's the greatest regret of his presidency that he didn't do more to reinforce the peacekeepers who were there on the ground. And the only sort of exception that proves the rule is the violence and the concentration camps and so forth that existed in Bosnia in the early to mid-1990s and then again in Kosovo in 1999. There you see that actually while the Clinton administration was itself unenthusiastic about getting involved militarily to stop the atrocities in Bosnia, there was a lot of political pressure domestically and bottom-up pressure that took a long time to make a difference, but eventually took a form up on Capitol Hill with the U.S. Congress that made President Clinton feel as if he had no choice really but to take strong measures. Now, it looked like UN peacekeepers were in trouble. It looked like the U.S. was going to have to get involved in order to rescue its European allies from a very awkward and deadly peacekeeping environment. So in a sense, the cost of doing nothing had risen. So Clinton felt that better to endure the risk of getting involved than to endure the obvious domestic political and then also practical geopolitical costs of not getting involved. So the cost-benefit calculus, which had always cut against doing more for the victims of genocide, for the first time cut in favor of acting, and President Clinton in the fall of 1995 did get involved, did intervene, and did save probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives 3.5 years into the conflict there. He also got involved in Kosovo in 1999, potentially preventing the deaths of tens of thousands of ethnic Albanians. So I think we see in the 20th century's history that presidents are rational actors up to a point at least. They respond to domestic political pressures when those come, and they are driven largely by national security and economic interests. And so in order to override those traditional prerogatives, it's really important for there to be citizen pressure, and if never again is to be made operational, it's going to be made operational by citizens who decide that that's what their government should stand for.
You just gave us numerous examples of U.S. inaction in times of genocide, and it seems that inaction continues. Last year, House Resolution 106, a bill calling for the recognition of the Armenian Genocide, did not pass, and some would say the situation in Gaza today is a genocide. What kind of an effect, if any, has our own resistance to interference had on us domestically?
Most Americans are not affected by our inaction. I think in the case of the Armenian Genocide resolution, it is obviously incredibly important to step forward and tell history like it is and acknowledge that what has happened has happened. I don't think denial or deceit are good practices to put in place within governmental structures. They're not good practices to teach our children, to say, well, we know what happened, but for these reasons of national interest, we're going to say something else. And you have your kids saying, well, why exactly? But if it happened, why wouldn't we be saying it happened? Does denial on the Armenian genocide at home give rise to inaction on Rwanda 80 years later? The consistent failure to make genocide prevention, punishment, acknowledgement, recognition a priority, it's all part of a pattern. I don't think one thing leads to another. I think all are just manifestations of the same impulse, which is to, sadly, too often neglect consideration of human consequences in decision-making.
And if we can go back to 1915, the United States had ample warnings from Ambassador Morgenthau, along with many other missionaries, consul generals, numerous articles written in the New York Times regarding the massacres. How did the U.S. respond back then?
Well, as always, there's a overarching national interest imperative. In World War I, it is a desire to stay out of that war, stay neutral, a desire to maintain at least tolerable ties with Germany and with Turkey. There is a larger kind of meta-protocol consideration, which is that you don't interfere in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. That's a kind of golden rule of that era. Even today, you hear Chinese diplomats and other diplomats in the developing world invoking the principle of sovereignty. Well, that was seen to be sacrosanct at that time.